I'm going to start by talking about a few famous Muslims through the ages, mostly in the Middle Ages and then a few more recent ones. The first one I'm going to talk about is a man who's called in the West Avicenna. Avicenna lived between 980 and 1037. He was Persian and he was a prodigy. I mean, when he was young, a child, he had already mastered logic, math, physics, and medicine before he hit the age of 20. In his lifetime, he published 5 different encyclopedias. This is multiple book collections that dealt with all sorts of different information. His first encyclopedia he published when he was only 20. So that gives you something to shoot for if you're not 20 yet. He was in great demand as a physician. He worked in the courts of sultans, and later on he wrote a philosophical encyclopedia that dealt with logic, physics, math, metaphysics, including many ideas from Aristotle. But he didn't just copy the words of Aristotle, he developed some of those ideas further. And remember that Aristotle was largely unknown in the West at this time. His works, Avicenna's works, were translated into Latin in Toledo in the year 1150, and this is how some of Aristotle's ideas were introduced into the West through the works of this Muslim scholar of an earlier generation. Avicenna accepted Aristotle's notion of 3 distinct human souls. There's the vegetable soul, that deals with growth and nutrition and reproduction. There's the animal soul that deals with movement and perception. And then finally, there's the rational soul that deals with intellectual thought. Avicenna may have been the very first person to distinguish between essence and existence. I don't have time to go into that whole philosophical exercise there, but this distinction between essence and existence is the philosophical foundation for the Roman Catholic doctrine of the transubstantiation of the host, where the host and the wine are transformed into the literal body and blood of Christ at the moment the priest elevates it. Avicenna is responsible for some developments even in Christian thought. Avicenna also said of God that if you're talking about created beings, things that God has created, describing that object's characteristics don't necessarily imply that the object exists. So, for example, you can describe a unicorn, what it looks like, it has this big horn on its head and so forth. That doesn't necessarily mean unicorns actually exist. However, when you're talking about God and you describe God's characteristics, one of God's characteristics is existence. And that proves, to Avicenna's mind, that God himself exists. This is a forerunner to a philosophical idea by the Christian scholar Anselm, the ontological argument for God's existence that came out just a few decades later. Now, similar to many Western philosophers, Avicenna didn't appeal to the Quran, just as Western philosophers didn't typically appeal to the Bible in making their philosophical arguments. They used what's called natural theology, deriving ideas about God from reason and ordinary experience rather than revelation. When Dante wrote the Divine Comedy, and he talked about all sorts of different people that were in hell and purgatory and heaven, he placed Avicenna in the realm of virtuous pagans in limbo. All right. The next person I want to talk about is Averroes. Averroes. He lived from 1126 to 1198, so he's a couple of centuries after Avicenna. He was born in Cordoba, modern-day Spain, which was a center of scholarly interaction among Muslims, Jews, and Christians. They would go there to study and to debate one another. he wrote, Avere wrote Defenses of Philosophy in a Muslim Setting, which was appreciated by many, but not by all. There were conservative scholars who attacked him and said, philosophy is contrary to faith. If you have faith, you don't need this philosophy. But he was a very prolific scholar. Averroes produced 38 commentaries on the writings of Aristotle, and thus he became known in the West as the commentator. Aristotle himself, after Aristotle's works were kind of rediscovered in the West, Aristotle was known as the philosopher, and Averroes was known as the commentator on the philosopher. He wrote 3 different types of commentaries on Aristotle's works. There was a short commentary, which is a summary. There was a long commentary, that is a commentary on every single line that Aristotle wrote in his works. And then a medium one that was a popularized version of the longer commentary. Averroes' works were translated into Hebrew and Latin in the West starting in the 13th century. And like Avicenna, Dante placed Averroes in the circle of virtuous pagans in limbo when he wrote his Divine Comedy. The next person I want to talk about is named Muhammad ibn Musa AlKhawarizmi, and we'll just go with his last name, which is AlKhawarizmi. If I can spell it right. AlKhawarizmi. He was a scholar. He was a Persian scholar, a mathematician. He adopted the Hindu numeral system in the year 820, or by the year 825, because he published a book on it. Oh, I didn't give you his dates. His dates are about 780 to about 850. So he's a predecessor to both Avicenna and Averroes. As I said, he adopted the Hindu numeral system that had been invented by Indian mathematicians around the year 500. Remember that the Romans by this time, and their descendants, the Germanic tribes, were using Roman numerals whenever they wanted to do numbers. And if you've ever tried to use Roman numerals in math, it's not very easy. So AlKhawarizmi adopted the Hindu number system. So he used 9 different symbols, and eventually a 10th, 0, to represent the 9 or the 10 different digits, right? And he used positional notation, base 10, to represent numbers. So what is nowadays known as the Arabic numerals, right, actually comes from someone who was not Arabic. He was Persian. He was Muslim, but he was Persian, and he adopted it in turn from people in India. So he began to describe how to use these numbers and positional notation to do mathematical equations. He wrote a book called The Compendious Book on Calculation by Completion and Balancing. And the Arabic word for calculation is al-jabr, and that gives us our word algebra. So AlKhawarizmi was the inventor of algebra, completion. It was a way of solving equations by adding numbers to both sides and completing these tasks. His works were translated into Latin about the year 1140. Another thing that AlKhawarizmi did was he took ideas of the Greeks, the geometric ideas of the Greeks, which were known in Europe, and he converted them to his numeric representation using these Hindu numbers and positional notation, and he demonstrated how circles and squares and curves could be represented algebraically. He also developed methods for solving systems of linear equations. You have a bunch of equations. How do you solve them? In fact, the word algorithm in English comes from AlKhawarizmi's name. AlKhawarizmi developed an algorithm, and so algorithms that are used in computer science, for example, come from his name. He also introduced the notion of quadratic equations, and he gave methods for solving them, and he also calculated trigonometric tables. So he was basically a mathematical genius, And these were some of the sorts of people that were in the Islamic world during what Christians call the Middle Ages. So it clearly wasn't a period of dark ages in the Islamic world. A group of Muslims that arose during the Middle Ages, they trace their ancestry back to the time of Muhammad, or at least to the time of the rightly guided caliphs. These are people called the Sufis. Sufis are Muslims who don't emphasize Islamic law or philosophy or theology. They seek to turn away from sin and love of this world and the search for fame and the obedience to satanic influence. They want to turn away from all those things and pay attention. They pay attention to certain hadiths that are mystical in nature. You can compare them in many ways to some of the mystics, followers of Kabbalah among the Jews in the Middle Ages, and some of the Christians too, who were interested in mysticism. And there are different orders of Sufis, and there are Sufis among the Sunnis and among the Shia. So they're not a separate group like Sunnis and Shias are, but they can be found in both groups. And they're opposed by some very strict Muslim groups like the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia. But Sufis, often mystical Christians, for example, monks, will get together with Sufis and hold conferences, and they'll talk about mystical ideas of God and their experiences and things like that. Well, one of these Sufi mystics in the Middle Ages was named Rumi, and he was also Persian. And he was a Persian poet and a judge and also a Sufi mystic. He is credited with inventing this whirling dance. I put a link on the class website to the whirling dervishes, where they kind of spin around, spin around, spin around. And this is a way, if you've ever spun around a lot, particularly when you were a kid, you spin around and you fall down because you're dizzy. This is a technique that Sufis sometimes use to free their minds of the sense of the material world and get in contact with God. Rumi believed that music, poetry, and dance were all paths leading to God, and he said that love is the only precept of religion. That's all you really need to do to be a good Muslim or follower of any religion, I suppose he would say. Now, in the 13th century, the early 13th century, there was a group in the Far East Asia called the Mongols under Genghis Khan, and he got his group of Mongols together, and they invaded from the east. He sacked Baghdad, executed the Caliph. The Mongols originally some of them were Nestorian Christians, some of them were Buddhists, some of them were shamanists, but they converted to Islam. Even though they sacked Baghdad, they converted to Islam in the late 13th century and took Islam back with them when they moved back to the east. Another group of nomads east of the Muslim lands, or initially east of the Muslim lands, were the Turks. They also converted to Islam, and they moved into Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, several centuries before they took it over, and they gradually took over more and more territory. Eventually, they captured the city of Constantinople in 1453, bringing the Byzantine Empire to its final end, and they established the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire lasted for several hundred years, from 1453 till 1918, right after World War I, when it was finally disbanded. And one of the people who led to the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, the ultimate dissolution, it was already falling apart, was a British officer by the name of T.E. Lawrence. If you've ever seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, that's the Lawrence I'm talking about. He worked with some of the Arab tribes in the Arabian Peninsula to fight with the British against the Ottomans, and eventually declare their own independence. And this is so he was influential in the founding of Saudi Arabia. Another important person in the 20th century was a guy by the name of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Ataturk was Turkish, and he led the Turkish War of Independence from the Ottoman Empire. And he was after he defeated them, he became the first president of Turkey, and is known as the father of the Turks. That's Ataturk. And the last person I want to mention is a man by the name of Ayatollah Khomeini. You may have heard of him. Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah is not his name; it's his title. That means he's the leader of, or one of the highest leaders of Shia Islam. He was a Persian or Iranian citizen, and he wanted to get rid of the Shah of Iran. He believed the Shah of Iran was corrupt. Well, he was, and needed to be overthrown. And he wanted to establish an Islamic state in Iran under the Shah. Iran was more or less secular country. I mean, the majority of people were Muslims for sure, but Islamic law wasn't forced on anybody. So Khomeini in 1979 led the Iranian Revolution that overthrew the Shah, and he took over the country and ran it until his death. And he was succeeded by a man named Khomeini. Sounds pretty similar. And he is still the main leader of Iran to this day. There have been other revolutions in the Islamic world. I think of the Arab Spring, for example. It started, there are several outbreaks of it within the last 10 years or so. So far, there haven't been any stable Islamic democracies that have been set up in the Arab world, anyways. But it's still, I think, too early in the process to know exactly what will develop. Islam is dominant today in southwestern and south central Asia, so countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, large parts of India. Islam, even though Hinduism is the main religion in India, the largest religion, Islam is the second largest religion in India. Islam is a dominant religion in Bangladesh and Indonesia, also in many countries in northern and eastern Africa. Okay. Now I want to say a few more things about just Islam in general. And I want to start with the story of Muhammad's night journey. This is a very important story in Islam. And it says that one night in the year before the Hijrah, remember the Hijrah was the journey that Muhammad and his followers made from Mecca to Medina. So the year before the Hijrah, Muhammad had this dream or vision, or perhaps, depending on who you ask, perhaps this really happened to him. And there's a short version of this story in the Quran, a longer version in the Hadiths. So in this story, Muhammad is taken by Jibril, that's the angel Gabriel. First, he's taken from Mecca to the very farthest mosque, Masjid al-Aqsa, the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. And from there, he climbs a ladder and goes through the various gates of heaven. While he's climbing this ladder, he meets various people who are prophets. He meets Adam, Isa, that's Jesus, Yahya, John the Baptist, Yusuf, that's Joseph, the prophet Joseph from the book of Genesis, the son of Jacob, that Joseph. He meets somebody named Idris, who scholars equate with Enoch in the Hebrew Bible. He meets Harun, that's Aaron, Moses' brother, Musa, that's Moses, and Abraham. So these are some of the people he meets on the ladder, and eventually he gets all the way up to the top of the ladder, and he gets to heaven, Jibril is still accompanying him. He shows him the house of Allah, and there are 70,000 angels who pray there daily, only to be replaced by 70,000 more the next day. So these angels are constantly praising Allah. There's a tree that marks the boundary of heaven beyond which no created being can pass. And this is interpreted to mean that there are limits to human beings' knowledge about God. Well, while he was up there in heaven, he has a conversation with Allah, and Allah tells Muhammad that his followers, that is, Muhammad's followers, should pray to God 50 times a day. So Muhammad says, okay, 50 times a day. So he starts to go down the ladder. When he gets partway down, he runs into Moses, and Musa says, well, what did Allah tell you? He says, well, among other things, he told me that my followers should pray 50 times a day. And Moses says, oh, that's not possible. That's impossible. Your followers will never do that. Go back up and see if you can whittle them down a little. So Muhammad goes back up the ladder and he says, hey, 50 is too much. What if they, can they possibly pray less? And so Allah says, okay, they can pray 40 times a day. So he goes back down the ladder. Musa says, 40 times is still too much. Try again. So he keeps going up and down the ladder. He gets God down to 30, then 20, then 10. Eventually, Allah says, okay, they need to pray to me 5 times a day. Muhammad descends the ladder. He tells Musa, God said 5 times a day. And Musa says, okay, I can live with that. I think that your people can live with that too. So that's the story of how Muslims came to pray to God 5 times a day. It also explains why Jerusalem is considered to be the 3rd holiest city in Islam. After Mecca and Medina, Jerusalem is the 3rd holiest city in Islam. And this story of Muhammad's night journey is celebrated as Laylat al-Miraj, which means in Arabic, the night of the ladder. It's celebrated by Muslims around the world. One of the words that you hear associated with Islam very often is Sharia, or sometimes it's called Sharia law. Sharia is an Arabic word that literally means a path, like a path to water. And it means God's will for humans. Fiqh is actually the Arabic word that means law. And it is humans' understanding of Sharia, that is God's will for humans. There are 5 different types of Sharia. There's obligatory Sharia. Those are things you have to do, like the 5 pillars of Islam. There's recommended Sharia, permissible Sharia. These are things that you can do if you want. Reprehensible Sharia. These are things that you definitely should not do. And finally, forbidden Sharia or haram. And this includes things that you definitely should not do, various sins, but also things like eating pork and things like that are considered haram or forbidden in Islam. Some Muslims carry with them a string of beads. They're sometimes called prayer beads. In Arabic, it's called misbaha or sibha. It's a string of prayer beads that have either 33 or 99 beads on them. And this is to recite the 99 names of God. You might think of it as similar to a rosary that Roman Catholics sometimes carry around. Muslims traditionally eat only halal foods, avoiding pork and other meat that hasn't been slaughtered properly. Halal is similar to kosher in Jewish tradition. The animals have to be slaughtered properly and the blood has to be drained out of them. And undoubtedly the 2 traditions are related to one another. And another thing about Muslims, what they eat, well, in this case, what they drink or don't drink, Muslims traditionally avoid alcohol. Now, there are some groups like the Alawites, like President Bashir of Syria is an Alawite. Alawites don't shun the drinking of alcohol, but most Muslims generally, traditionally anyways, avoid alcohol. There's a story, a hadith, about Muhammad when he was on his night journey. He was offered a glass of wine and a glass of milk by the angel Jibril, and Muhammad looks at the wine, he looks at the milk, and he chooses the milk. And Jibril says to him, if you had chosen wine, your nation would have gone astray. So this explains why Muslims don't drink wine. All right, that's it for Islam.